Okay, moving on to the last and final segment of today's show. There's been something just around the news of college basketball that I realized that I thought I really wanted to share with you guys, and that is this. Last week, we spoke about, all the transfers and where they could possibly be going and the impact it had on all their teams and all that good stuff. And that still all stands. There's still plenty of transfers, and every day there's at least a couple news in the transfer portal that really does stand out, and there are some news that does sometimes really surprise you. But at the same time, that's not exactly the narrative I'm going to be talking about today with this segment. And the thing I'm going to be talking about is I feel like usually in the transfer portal, or when the transfer portal and transfers first became a thing, it usually was just because either a personal issue or the player that transferred just wasn't clearly happy with their role. And I don't want to say transferring was just not the normal, but you rarely saw good players that already had an established role transfer, especially in high majors. Like with mid majors, you understand if you average 18 points a game at Charleston Southern and you want to transfer up and play in the A10, or if you want to transfer because you averaged 15 or 20 or was a very productive player in a league like the Atlantic 10 or the Mountain West, transferring up to a Power 6 league, all those things. Yes, I understand. All those things make a ton of sense. But I feel like back a couple years ago, we didn't have not only as many people transferring, but as many guys that had significant roles on the team that they were already on transferring. I already picked out 10 guys that have transferred this offseason that I want to talk about today that I feel like a couple years ago you wouldn't have seen transferred because they have such a big role on their team. And by that, the most people that I am putting in this category are people that play for a Power 6 or 7 conference team. I only have one mid-major player on here, and all these players, the common theme with them is that they already had their role, and still, even with that being said, they decided to transfer. So a couple players I picked out to talk about, here we go. The first one, this kid actually announced where he will be going yesterday, and it's still unknown whether he will be eligible or not, but that is the USC transfer, Elijah Weaver, and he will be transferring from USC to the University of Dayton. And I think this is a very interesting move for Elijah Weaver and for Dayton, because when you look at what exactly Weaver did for USC, in the preseason, I didn't think Weaver was going to break out, but I thought he would probably end up emerging as USC's starting point guard. Unfortunately, that was not the case. So this transfer actually does make a little bit of sense. The fact that Ethan Anderson has established himself as the starting point guard for USC. Anderson was a kid that averaged 4.2 assists per game last year, while Weaver only averaged 6.6 and 1.8, assists per game. And he will be going to Dayton, who before Weaver's commitment I had as a bubble team. Obviously, the loss of Obi Toppin really does hurt them. But with Weaver, with Crutcher and Landers, both one of those guys will be coming back. The other one is unknown. They have Ibi Watson still. So I think if Weaver comes back, Dayton could definitely be a fringe NCAA tournament team. It just is obviously very unfortunate that they're going to miss Obi Toppin, man. That guy's going to be a top 5 pick in the NBA draft. He was a stud, and Elijah Weaver was in the news the other day after he did indeed announce the transfer. How about this one? And this is going to be the first kind of head-scratching one. We'll go to the Big Ten and talk about Nogel Eastern. And Eastern was a kid we spoke about last week on the show. But the more I thought about it, it's this. When do you ever see a kid transfer who is the starting point guard of a team transfer in conference and sit out a year? Eastern has also been testing the NBA waters for the past 2 years, and it's not like he's gotten any better. And maybe that's why he transferred. Maybe he just thought, okay, my offensive game isn't really going to ever work out at Purdue. They have Stefanovic. They have Travion Williams. And if you guys remember, Matt Painter, the head coach of Purdue, actually went on Dan Dakic's radio show in Indiana last week and did this whole rant on transfers. And to be honest, I kind of get it. Nogel Eastern is an intricate part of your team. And not only is he transferring this late in the offseason, he's transferring to your conference rival, Michigan. Like, what? I don't know. I just feel like there's a way to deal with it, and transferring to a rival school in your own league just isn't really something we used to see. But I'm not upset with Nogel Eastern. It just is a decision that caught my eye, especially because he does have to sit out next season. The next one, the kid we just mentioned, Mac McClung. He will be announcing his decision later today. His top 7 is Texas Tech, Auburn, Memphis, USC, BYU, Arkansas, and Wake Forest. And right now, it is likely that, here's what I think, right? If Mac McClung is actually going to be on a college basketball roster next season, I can't see him sitting out. I think if he doesn't go pro, he has to be eligible because I just can't see him pulling a no-gel Eastern and being like, all right, I'm going to sit out for a year and then transfer and then go to the NBA. I just can't see McClung as that kind of kid. And unlike no-gel Eastern, I think McClung's a really good player. And I think Eastern's good too. I think he's a really good defender. But McClung is an impact player. And if he's on your team, if he's on the floor, he's going to make a big-time impact. I listed him as my number 1 transfer that was on the market last week. But there are also a couple questions with him. He said that the reason why he wanted to leave Georgetown is so he could play point guard. I don't necessarily know if he could be a successful starting point guard. I think his strength is shooting and scoring, and he is the best off the ball. But at the same time, Mac McClung, if he would have came back to Georgetown, he would have been their leading scorer, and he would have been their best player. And I'm not going to say Georgetown would have been a tournament team or anything, but if you would have had a team of McClung and Wahab and Jalen Harris and Jamarco Pickett, I don't think Georgetown would have been that bad. Javon Blair also, and especially in Patrick Ewing's case, this was a team that has to make the NCAA tournament this year, or else Pat Ewing's job may be in trouble. Obviously, he's a Georgetown legend, so you don't really know how exactly they're going to manage that situation if he keeps falling short of expectations, which right now it doesn't really look too promising that Georgetown is going to be an NCAA tournament team really next season. But Mac McClung was a very integral part of that offense, and if he just wanted to transfer to get on a better team, I guess I get it. But it's just very rare you see all of a sudden a team's leading scorer and a team's clear-cut best player transfer like that. Another kid like that, and ironically enough, in the same conference, and also ironically enough, Georgetown's rival, that is LJ Figueroa, who announced the other day that he will be transferring from St. John's. He hasn't really put out a list yet of any schools that have been interested, but LJ Figueroa was another kid. He was set to be St. John's leading scorer and top player this year. And I didn't have St. John's as a top 25 team, but I had them as a preseason team that could make the NCAA tournament. I had them as a preseason top 5 team in the Big East. I actually think Mike Anderson did a pretty solid job last year considering the circumstances. When you look at the fact that even though he did bring back LJ Figueroa and Mustafa Heron, besides those two guys, there weren't really many impact players that returned from the team with Shamori Pons that made the NCAA tournament from the previous season with Chris Mullen. And there were some of the younger guys on St. John's that had a better season last year than originally anticipated. Look at Champagny. Look at Marcellus Erlington. He's a kid that really broke out, especially towards the back end of last season. Josh Roberts as well. So I really liked St. John's roster when they had Figueroa, and they're going to be losing Mustafa Heron as well, and I'm just confused by LJ Figueroa's decision to transfer. Obviously, if he thinks that it's the best decision for him, I'm not going to criticize it, and there's even a good chance that Figueroa is going to go pro. And same with McClung. There's no guarantee whatsoever that either of these guys are going to be playing college basketball next year, and they're going to have to get a waiver from the NCAA if they're going to be ruled eligible. So all this conversation could be for nothing. But at the same time, why are you entering the transfer portal if you want to go pro? It's really a lot of these athletes' decisions just don't really make that much sense to me. And I think LJ Figueroa really is at the top of the list. I don't know, man. I just think St. John's could have been a really good fringe top 25 team this season, and Figueroa would have been one of the better players on their team. So him leaving doesn't really surprise me. But I'll say this, if he does get eligible next season, he will be another very important and very impactful piece for whatever team he goes to. Another big-time transfer in the news the other day. How about Justin Smith announcing he's leaving Indiana? And Justin Smith is another guy. He is a double-digit scorer in the Big Ten that is just going to be on the market all of a sudden in late May, which rarely happens. Last year, I remember we had Kerry Blackshear around this time, who did take a very long time to make his decision in terms of what school he was going to go to. I totally get it. But at the same time, Justin Smith announcing the other day, especially after Indiana, it's ironically enough, if you guys remember, I just did that whole segment on Indiana basketball last week and how good and productive I think they're going to be next season. But Justin Smith was a guy that was very productive on their team as well. Former double-digit scorer, and he's going to be a guy that he's not going to be a star. I don't think he's ever going to be a guy that is your leading scorer, but he's a guy that's been productive in the past. And even though, Justin Smith transferring doesn't shock me as most, because Indiana does have a crowded front court, and even though I like Justin Smith's game, he's never really been the most consistent player at IU. So I'm not shocked that he left when you also consider Joey Brunk and Trace Jackson Davis both returning as well. But Smith is another guy. Anytime you get a good Big Ten player on the market this late in the season, you could definitely use that to your advantage. We know Olivier Sarr was the other big name that transferred from Wake Forest to Kentucky, but that makes sense assuming he's eligible. Wake Forest lost their coach Danny Manning, and new coach Steve Forbes could be in a very tricky spot. Once again, what if Mac McClung goes there? So we'll see. Matt Harms announced he's going from Purdue to BYU. Matt Harms is another guy. He's not a star. He's never really going to be your leading scorer, but at the same time, he's a guy that's been very productive in his career in the Big Ten for good teams. He's played in Elite Eight games. He's played in Sweet 16 games down the stretch. And when you're a team like BYU that did lose a lot from last year's squad that was very good, having that experience on your team now really should help you. And Matt Harms, once again, he's not ever going to be your team's leading scorer, but experience is key, and it's very rare you have a guy like that when you're a team like BYU fall into your hands that quickly. Also, Romello White. If Romello White stays at Arizona State, I would have had the Sun Devils as like a top 10 team in the preseason. They bring in Josh Christopher, a top 10 recruit. Hopefully they bring back Remy Martin, who is right now 50-50 on the NBA draft. They also bring back Alonzo Verge, a former JUCO player that was awesome down the stretch for the Sun Devils last season, as well as Tayshaun Cherry, Kamani Lawrence. So I actually really like the Sun Devils core for this season. The problem was they didn't have any size. They had one big man, Romello White, who was very productive. And to be honest, Romello White was one of the main reasons why I was so high on Arizona State this season. And once again, I'm not criticizing him for transferring. If he thinks that going to Ole Miss and playing for Kermit Davis is the best move for him, then he should have absolutely went for it. But at the same time, I just think from a pure logistical basketball perspective and what I think makes the most sense, him leaving Arizona State is baffling to me. Baffling. Because I think that team could have been very, very good. And maybe he just hated Bob Hurley. That's very possible. And there's nothing worse as a player when you're playing for a coach that just you don't like and you don't want to play for. So I get it. But I'm just saying from a pure basketball perspective, I was very surprised when Romello White decided to leave Arizona State. And I do also feel like this is a little bit of the common theme here. I do feel that a lot of times recently we've been seeing just week after week, day after day, surprise transfer after surprise transfer. And it's really surprising, man. It really is. A lot of times, if you would have told me the last day of the regular season last year that Romello White would be transferring, I would have thought you were crazy. Same with LJ Figueroa, same with Mac McClung, and same if you would have told me Nojel Eastern not only would be transferring, but in conference and having to sit out a year. Just absolutely wild. But once again, that's just college basketball these days, and I guess we're going to have to deal with it. One other transfer announcement I want to make, and then we'll get out of here. Donnie Tillman commits to Chris Jans at New Mexico State. Tillman was very good 2 years ago at Utah. This is actually going to be his third school, as it's his second time transferring. Wasn't really able to find his feet at UNLV last season. But at the same time, I think Tillman's a good player, and especially playing at New Mexico State, I think that could definitely help his cause, So just wanted to say, Donnie Tillman transferring, that was one that made a little more sense to me than some of the other ones.